Okay, so I know why you're here. You're here to hear my opening joke, are you not? Over the years, when I talk to people from past churches, that's the first thing they always mention. We miss the jokes, especially the corny ones. And, I don't have a joke this morning, I apologize. But I do have a rather snarky quote. This is from an American journalist and satirist, H.L. Mencken, from many years ago, who said, and I want you to try to get a visual image of this, okay? Democracy is the art of running the circus from the monkey cage. It'll sink in a moment. Last week I decided that I would not speak about the election because it was too soon. Emotions were too high. People were either in shock or they were overly ecstatic, depending upon whom a person had supported. And so I shared a prayer with you from the Franciscan writer Richard Rohr because I did not trust myself enough to sound neutral or unbiased. I believe as a pastor it is imperative that I remain neutral and unbiased in politics, especially from the pulpit. After all, I am called to be your shepherd, and some of you are red shepherd or sheep, and some of you are blue sheep, and many of you are purple sheep. And as far as I can tell, you all love each other, which is it's a good model for the country. I know that some of you voted for Mr. Trump. Some of you voted for Secretary Clinton. Some of you voted for a third-party candidate. And some of you did not vote at all. And I know that some of you who did vote had to hold your nose as you were voting because you were not very excited about your candidate. And some of you were very excited about your candidate. Even so, that's the picture. But in recent weeks and months, we heard a lot about how we were choosing between the lesser of two evils. Now, whether that's true or not, the view of many Americans was that both major party candidates had flaws that were unacceptable. And I don't need to go into all that here. The other obvious point to make about this election is that most people were very surprised at the outcome. How many of you were surprised at the outcome? Yes. Should we have been surprised? In a world where Bob Dylan can win the Nobel Prize in Literature and the Cubs can win the World Series, is it too far-fetched to think that a billionaire TV reality star might become president of the United States? I think it's safe to assume that we now live in a world that is as unpredictable as the weather. And you know what they say about the weather? And by they, I mean people from every place I've ever lived. You are not unique in this. They say that if you don't like the weather here, just wait one day and it'll change, right? Well, for good or ill, we live in a country where many people never ever seem to be satisfied with the political weather. We're always looking for climate change in Washington, it seems. Just look at the approval rates of Congress. And in my opinion, the one thing that might have put Mr. Trump into the winner's circle was his last-minute promise to drain the swamp. Why the discontent? Well, I believe that many Americans do not believe that the status quo works for them any longer. Think about what has been the campaign buzzword for the last two winners of presidential elections, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. The buzzword was change, right? And so this is the America that we inhabit. It is a land of the unsatisfied, home of the malcontents. Let's face it, we are a nation of malcontents. We are a nation of people who are often unhappy or angry about something. My guess is that it began with the Revolutionary War. Those guys didn't throw all that tea into Boston Harbor because they were literally having a party. They were ticked off. Now, of course, people don't become malcontented dissatisfied, angry, frustrated, in a vacuum. Many Americans, rightly or wrongly, believe that the old guard has let them down. And so they voted for somebody who didn't look like the old guard. This doesn't make us unique or different or weird. By the way, Brexit serves as another recent example of what we might call populist malcontents rising up and gaining political power. But that's only a more recent example. People have been unhappy with their leaders for a long, long time. Listen to the prophet Jeremiah in the 23rd chapter of his book. He is channeling the angry voice of God. Woe to the shepherds, he says, that is the political leaders, who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. Now, compared to the plight of Jeremiah's people, our political climate is sunny and warm. They were living through a political hurricane. The context for the book of Jeremiah is the Babylonian exile. Think of that. We're not in exile today. They were in exile. Partly due to the ineptitude of their leaders, the Israelites are in captivity. Through Jeremiah, however, God promises to one day restore sovereignty to the Israelites. Their future king, he says, will be like David, a shepherd king, one that will not allow his sheep to be scattered again. Jeremiah 23 is one of the most politically relevant passages in the entire Bible because it speaks to our basic human need to have leaders we can trust. Now, we may not be able to trust the polls anymore. I mean, can you imagine 4 years from now when the pollsters start doing their thing, or 2 years from now? We're all going to laugh, are we not? We may not be able to trust the polls. We may not be able to trust the social media news sites, which we learned this week. More than half of the news of our news feed in Facebook and such and Twitter and all that were false news stories. We may not be able to trust social media or the polls, but we darn sure want to be able to trust our leaders. And at the same time, we yearn for a sense of common purpose. You know, one of the dominant themes that I've been hearing in the last week and a half, maybe you have too, is the theme of unity. It seems that people on all sides, from all political stripes, are saying things like, let's just all come together. Now, personally, I think that's largely a pipe dream, and yet it speaks to who we really are as Americans. We want to be the United States of America, even when we fiercely disagree with some of our fellow Americans. Fortunately, being united in spirit does not necessarily mean being uniform in thought or ideology. We can come together without having to adopt the same ideology. All we need is a common purpose. And that common purpose, I believe, is to have a successful country and lots of well-being for its citizens. We can live with a little divisiveness, a little difference of opinion, but the last thing we want is for our leaders to make our divisiveness worse, to scatter the sheep even more than they're already scattered. We don't want our leaders to exacerbate the situation. That's all we ask. Jeremiah's point, I think, in chapter 23 is that God wants the flock, that is God's people, which is us today as well, to be together and to be safe. He addresses the fear of his people, which is very understandable given the situation in which they found themselves. In verse 4, he writes, I, that is God, will raise up shepherds over them who will shepherd them, and they shall not fear any longer or be dismayed, nor shall any be missing, says the Lord. And to further his point, Jeremiah predicts that one day Israel will live in safety. There's nothing we ask more from our leaders than to keep us safe. Now, don't hear the following in a partisan way, because I don't mean it in a partisan way. I'm just going to state reality. This is actual facts. There was some rhetoric that we heard in this past election that created some fear in certain segments of our population. Fairly or unfairly to Mr. Trump, there are many people in this country today who are simply fearful about things, about their future, so forth. And of course, I'm speaking specifically about immigrants and Muslims and LGBT people and people of color and even women. And in fact, we have already seen an uptick in hate crimes and hate speech. And to Mr. Trump's credit, he looked into a camera the other day and he told those people to stop. He told them to stop. At the same time, we've seen protests in the streets, a few of which have turned into riots. And all of this climate that we find ourselves in has led people on both sides of the political spectrum to be concerned about our overall safety. Interestingly, because of that, we're a creative lot. Someone in the last couple of weeks came up with the idea of wearing a safety pin in a visible way on one's shirt or jacket to send a clear message to people who may feel some fear at this moment in history. That is, we've got your back. We're going to work to keep you safe. Well, it's so funny. After only a few days of this safety pin social media phenomenon, I began to hear some other voices saying things like, well, wearing a safety pin, it's not good enough. You actually have to be willing to protect those who don't feel safe in our society. One person put it very well. Wearing a safety pin as a symbol of support for the marginalized is like putting a Band-Aid over a broken heart to stop it from bleeding. So I got a little confused about all this. Do I wear a safety pin to offer a symbolic gesture, or do I not wear one because I might actually chicken out and not stand up for someone who's being verbally or physically attacked? I didn't really think a whole lot about it until the other day. I got up and I was getting dressed, and I noticed that the dry cleaners had attached their tag to my pants with a small safety pin. And I was trying to take it off, and it was really hard. It was so small, and my fingers just don't work that well. And all the while, I'm asking myself, maybe I should keep it on. I don't know. Everybody's wearing safety pins. But then I realized, wearing a safety pin on your belt loop is probably not what the safety pin people had in mind when they came up with that. So my life just got very confusing. Eventually, I was able to take it off. Jeremiah 23, in the section we read, it concludes with a vision of this future king. And I think this is an important vision. This king will practice two things: justice and righteousness. Now, I want you to notice, because I did, how that phrase, justice and righteousness, sort of summarizes, I know the translation is not that great, but in my mind, it sort of summarizes the basic priorities of the two camps in American political culture, the liberals and the conservatives, respectively. It's a little bit of a generalization, but I think it's true. Liberals emphasize social justice. Conservatives tend to emphasize personal righteousness. Not that the two, that people can't cross over, right, and do that. But is Jeremiah's vision of a future king trying to tell us that our ideological perspectives are merely two sides of the same coin, and that we need to be paying attention to both sides of that coin? Okay, so what am I trying to say with all this? I'm trying to say, yeah, we're a nation of malcontents. But that's not always a bad thing. Not at all. As long as our nation and world are imperfect, led by imperfect people, as long as our citizens and other people around the world live in fear of some sort, as long as we allow our lack of uniformity in thought to lead to disunity in spirit, then we need to stay malcontented. Malcontent is the engine that moves us forward as a nation and as a species. I love the quote from the great moral and social philosopher Eric Hoffer. He said decades ago, "A nation without dregs and malcontents is orderly, peaceful, and pleasant, but perhaps without the seed of things to come." So be a malcontent. Keep doing it. And yet at the same time, isn't it wonderful that Thanksgiving is just right around the corner, a few days away, reminding us that there's a flip side to being a malcontent? Doesn't this week remind us that in spite of our unhappiness at times, anger and frustration, whenever that occurs and for whatever reason, we can flip that coin to the other side and we can express thankfulness for what we really have in this country? I think it does. Amen.